Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being with us in your different parts of the world here at the Atlantic Dialogues Talks. It's truly an honor to be here with you. My name is Omeira Issa, and today we have gathered an incredible group of individuals, a very powerful panel to talk with us and to us about COVID-19 and racism. So this other pandemic called racism as we are all dealing with COVID-19. Of course, the Atlantic Dialogue talks are a phenomenal moment for different people in different parts of the world to come together. So thank you for the center for putting this incredible event together. Our panelists, we have here Tosin Durotoy. She is joining us from Nigeria, and Tosin has more than 15 years of experience in both public and private sectors, and she has a wealth of experience throughout Nigeria and the United States. We also have with us Ana Barreto, who is the Director of Programs at Afro Resistance. She's also a graduate student in International Affairs at the New School, and she's a researcher on immigration with special focus on women and girls. So really excited to have her here as well. Cassie Freeman, who's the President and CEO of African Diaspora Consortium. She is as well the past president of the Comparative and International Education Society, and she's the second African-American woman to be elected to this position. And last but certainly not least, we've got Alex T. Johnson, who's Chief of Staff at U.S. Helsinki Commission. And of course, that is for the 116th Congress. Prior to his appointment to the Commission, he served as Senior Policy Advisor for Europe and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundation. So very excited to have all of them here with us. Of course, COVID-19 has changed many things for us. Right now, I'm in Canada, and of course, race disparities as well are bringing COVID-19 to a different light. Let's start with Casey Freeman, if we could. Your organization, African Diaspora Consortium, has gathered information on health and healthcare disparities, as well as the impact of COVID-19 on people of African descent throughout different parts of the world, the US, UK, Brazil. How is that going, and what have you learned that you can share with us?
Thank you. Let me also indicate that I am thrilled to be here, thrilled and honored, and especially to be present with this group of accomplished individuals on this panel. Always a pleasure, an honor to be included in the Atlantic Dialogue discussions. What I want to say is, actually, I am really surprised that people are surprised that COVID-19 or the pandemic would shine a light on the race and racism. Historically, the African descendants during the transatlantic slave trade, that was the ultimate act of brutality and racism, and that has not abated. I mean, that has continued throughout. So the fact that we are at this particular point in time, though, provides us a unique opportunity if we stop to think about it. I mean, because issues like police brutality, whether we are in the US, Brazil, the UK, or all points beyond, the what we know or have seen is that police brutality, undereducation, unemployment, poverty are always the highest among African descendants wherever we are. But this has provided, if we think about it, this could provide us a unique opportunity to address issues in different ways. The Black Lives Matter movement, I think, provided what it did demonstrate is that when we come together across countries, across all 50 states and 60 countries, we had an opportunity to see the unity and solidarity in ways that we had not before. So why could we not use this as an opportunity to ask a different set of questions? What if we use our strength to build an agenda or agency across countries? What if we moved from only a country nationalist agenda perspective to a country and international perspective? Racism is not new. I mean, although it had the concept of institutional racism had its origin, or is just, at least assigned to the Stokely Carmichael and people during that particular period of time, but it has been here throughout. And what we have done with our organization is to bring together doctors, economists, educators to examine these issues across 3 countries: the US, the UK, and Brazil, working with our good colleague, Dr. Vicente there, the president of Only Historically Black College. So this is what we are doing, is to use the opportunity not to pretend or act as though we're surprised that it is existing, but to think about what other types of questions we could ask, how we can utilize our voices collectively as opposed to individual countries. So we're thinking about it from collective voices as opposed to individual voices, because the issues are the same across all of our countries.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of absolutely all of our countries, let's turn a little bit to Brazil. Ana Barreto, there's particularly a case of a young boy recently, Miguel Otávio. Tell us a little bit about what that situation was like and how it sheds light to this important topic that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone. Thank you for the invitations. Really honored to be here, to be talking about such a pressing and historically neglected issue. And I think that sometimes it really helps to bring humanity to the data, right? So sometimes we are talking a lot about the data and the numbers, but today I want to use my minutes to talk about the story of Miguel Otávio. And I want you to come with me in this story. So 5 a.m. in Recife, Brazil, is getting ready to start her day. She lives in one of the 5 Brazilian states that included domestic workers as essential workers during the pandemic. So the states determined that domestic workers should work even during the city lockdowns. It's cruelty because quarantine should not be a privilege. And this is said by Luisa Batista, the president of the National Domestic Workers Union. Mites has a brilliant and full of life 5-year-old boy, Miguel. Since there is a lockdown in the city, the schools are closed. So Miguel has to go with Mites wherever she goes. So she has no choice but to take him to her work. And they arrive at the rich part of the city, more than an hour ride away by bus from where they live, to serve the rich white Brazilian elite. Mites' boss asked her to take the dog for a walk since she was having a manicure at the house. When Mites returned from the walk, she see her 5-year-old boy on the ground dying. So what happened between those minutes? What happened between the dog walk? Miguel, a 5-year-old boy, started asking for her mother and trying to look for her. He goes to the elevator where the boss, instead of telling the boy to go back inside, she pressed the 9th floor button and walks away. Miguel then fell from the 9th floor and is now on the floor dying, where Mirtis, her mother, is coming back from taking the dog for a walk. She killed my dreams. She ended my life. That's the words of Mirtis. The death of a 5-year-old boy should never be seen as collateral damage for the rich people to be served. Mirtis has more than 6 million other domestic workers in Brazil. Works 7 days a week. Sometimes they live on the rich family's house. They have little contact with their own children. 70% of the domestic workers in Brazil are Black women. And when we look at the stories of Mirtis and Miguel, what we see is an incomplete process of abolition. This is a story that brings so many topics that we can talk about. How when we talk about health, we are talking about employment, we are talking about dignity, we are talking about housing, we are talking about who is seen as human and who is not seen as human. That woman that pressed the 9th floor, she didn't see the boy as a person or as a child, as her own child, because I doubt that she would do that with her own children. In an interview after, she said that the boy was responsible for his own death. A 5-year-old boy, that's what she said. So I want to bring this story to the table to think, and I'm pretty sure that my colleagues here were going to talk about the virus, how the virus affects more Black people, but I also want to bring another dimension on the structural challenges that we were facing before are now really life or death situation. So to put domestic workers as essential workers because the rich people cannot clean their own dishes, this is cruelty. This is cruelty. And this is what is happening in Brazil. The first fatal victim in Brazil of COVID-19 was also a domestic worker. The rich family was traveling to Italy. When they came back to Brazil, they felt ill. They took the test, but they forgot to mention to the domestic workers that they probably have the virus. So she got it from them. And these are also the conversations that I want to bring when we think about the impacts of the virus, when we think about if we are Black people or brown people, we have more chances of not only contamination, but to die from it. But also, even when we don't have the virus, we are put in situations like Mirtis, that you leave for a walk, a 10-minute walk, and when you come back, your son is dead. So I want to bring this to the conversation, and of course, we can talk a little bit more on the next minutes. Thank you.
Looks like I was muted there for a minute. Anna, thank you for this. You've brought up the question of systemic racism in Brazil. Let's cross the ocean and talk a little bit about Nigeria, not this time systemic racism, but systemic inequalities. Tosin, you're the CEO and primary consultant at Concelia Advisory. What can you tell us about the End SARS movement? We've, of course, seen millions of people on the streets talking about police brutality, talking about the need for change. Tell us a little bit about how that plays into what's going on right now as we talk about the lives, Black Lives Matter, so the lives of Black people all over the world.
Thank you so much, Amara, for that question. It's a question that I have spent a lot of time thinking about and processing over the last couple of months. As someone who occupies what I call a liminal space, you know, in the sense that I am both an American citizen, but also a Nigerian citizen. And so I've been sort of having to witness a lot of what's been going on from those two lenses. And I have to say, just as starting out, that it's been very exhausting. It's been very exhausting as a Black person, as a Black woman, to have to figure out how to process that kind of tragedy that you see over and over again. We've normalized these things in a way now. The massacre that happened with NSARS, I was not far from where I lived. I could hear the shots going off. And so it put me in a space where I started to ask myself a series of questions. What are the lessons that I am learning from this experience in this 1 year where all of a sudden it seems as though there is instability around the world, but also it's bringing to fore a lot of issues that have been buried deeply for so long. I think that's also what we're witnessing. And as was said earlier, I think we have to understand that racism is the original sin of the United States. And that's, you know, was said earlier, that that's not going anywhere. That's something that they have contended with in that country, on that land for over 400 years. And I believe that that's what this season taught us, is that that has not gone anywhere. It still exists, right? And so in looking at Black Lives Matter, as I observe that, you know, I see the parallel between Black Lives Matter and End SARS, but I also see it even in the Arab Spring, right? It's a rebellion. We are no longer going to be quiet, or we are in a state of unrest. And of course, you know, many of the think tanks and such predicted that this would be the case in many countries, in a number of countries in the global South, just because they were already sort of in a very fragile position before COVID arrived. And so obviously we knew that was going to shake them in a foundational way. So as was said earlier, we can't really be surprised that COVID has sort of been a revealer of so many things to us during the season, because surely the things that we're seeing are things that have been there all along, but maybe we just decided not to take as close of a look. But now we've had to confront, and it's been violent in many places. It's been uncomfortable, it's been painful, but that's what's been happening this year. I think when we talk about racism and we think about it from the angle of systemic versus systematic, we know the difference in those two words is that, well, systematic has to do with, you know, how the decisions you make that are based on race. So you can say to someone, you know, I'm not going to hire you because you're Black, or I'm not going to do this because you're Black, or I'm going to make assumptions about you, bias this because you're a Black person, or a person of color, or an immigrant, or any of these others. However, systemic is that it was built that way. It was built to purpose. It was built to fit, so that we can ensure that the structures continue to work, whether there's anyone, quite frankly, operating it or not. It just works that way because that's the way it was built. That's the way it was designed. It's meant to oppress and keep people of color and others really as second-class citizens, if I may say so. Now, in the case of Nigeria, where do I draw the parallels? We also suffer from that original sin here in this land. Because if we trace back sort of where we're coming from, we'll realize that we also have institutions here that were structured post-colonialism. You know, if we wanted to go all the way back, we were also victims of the transatlantic slave trade, of course. But I think in recent history, we can go as far back as the colonial legacy that we had and what was left to us. In many cases, a lot of countries on the continent that were colonized didn't really get a chance to, I would say, restructure, or in some cases tear down those structures that were left behind for them to inherit. The same is true here in Nigeria, where essentially, if you were to look at our history, you can tell that some of the systems and the structures that we're operating within are really remnants and legacies of the colonial rule. And so we never really addressed that. And I think it has gone on to bleed into our structures of governance. It has gone on to bleed into our ways of governing, and so on and so forth. And so when we look at that, the same question arises is, okay, so what was NSARS about? Well, NSARS is about essentially the fact that these structures continue to exist. Now, it may not be based on skin color, but it sure is based on something else. And it's not for the people, and it's to oppress the people and to keep people's voices from being heard and to ensure that people continue to be marginalized, just that like Black people are in the US and other people of color and immigrants and others. And so on and so forth. So we see the parallel. Like I said, it might not be the exact same mirror, but we cannot deny the fact that the roots are the same. The structures, the systemic nature of the structures are things that we continue to suffer from and continues to be brought to light, especially during this very difficult time in, I guess, humankind's development in history, is to say we have a lot to reflect on. And in the case of Nigeria, our question then becomes, what is no longer serving us? You know, in the case of the US, we don't know how people of color are going to get rid of the legacy of slavery because the whole country is built on that. So how do you extract yourself from that? How do you extract yourself from a land where you were pretty much, you know, taken to and told this is now where you will be and this is how you will be treated and you're going to have to fight for basic rights? But we are in this Black Republic. We are in Africa. We are in Nigeria in my case. And so the question then becomes, how do we restructure these institutions? How do we tear down these institutions? Is it possible? Is it something that's possible through the electoral process? I mean, these are questions that I'm putting out there for discussion because I think it's easier said than done. But when you look at some of the historical context of what we're talking about, you start to realize that what we're dealing with as well, instances of trauma, we're dealing with instances of just complete lack of trust and distrust in the system. You see that in America as well. So how do we get the people to feel once again that they are part of the story, that they can be part of the development? Like I said, you know, the African Americans have always voted in historic numbers. Generally, African Americans tend to be a very significant voting bloc when we look at the sort of electoral outcomes in the US. And there's a reason why it's like that. It's because they have somehow, even though there remains some divisiveness, as is the case amongst people of Black color everywhere, at the end of the day, we do know that in this case, we have to look at it from then, excuse my phone, that we have to look at it from a robust view and decide how we want to move forward in both instances. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this. I think we've mentioned definitely racism. Alex, what kind of transatlantic initiatives can be put in place to address racism, which clearly is a huge concern in this global world that we live in, regardless of where people are right now in this world?
Thank you, Omera. And it's really difficult to add much to what my esteemed colleagues on this panel have already done in terms of capturing essentially the scope and framing the issue. I think what's better for me to contribute, as you rightly said, is to really extend what Dr. Freeman brought up associated with the global response to these issues. And that is exactly what, under the leadership of Chairman Al C. Hastings, the U.S. Helsinki Commission has endeavored to do. During this Congress, one of the things that we started with was an effort to convene a number of hearings on human rights at home, reflecting on how the global movement to end racism and adjust and respond to, of course, numerous cases of lives lost in police violence, but also the disparities associated with the pandemic. As people have mobilized to the streets, we sought to convene hearings that essentially reflected on U.S. international commitments and how within our municipalities and within our federal government, we were living up to those demands of those in the streets. Particularly within the context of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And this was really an extension of well over a decade of programming led by Chairman Hastings, initiated with a Black European Summit in Brussels, where there's been a movement among elected officials on both sides of the Atlantic to collectively respond to the legacy of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade through agreements. So one of the things that there's an opportunity, especially with the new presidential administration starting soon, is to essentially actualize the proposals that have been on the table for some time for a transatlantic agreements on policies where both the United States can work with the European Union, as well as the UK and other nations to essentially hold each other accountable for measures that will address the systemic and systematic issues that colleagues previously addressed. We have done quite a bit in terms of introducing legislation and other mechanisms to essentially build that capacity, but essentially there is a lot already on the table, especially as a part of we're a number of years into the International Decade for People of African Descent. And we need to find an opportunity, even in a pandemic, in a moment like this, where there is the political will to move forward, to galvanize that and create those opportunities. So as we continue the conversation, I would be happy to discuss more details about some of those proposals. Thank you.
Thank you. Casey, you've brought to the table the importance or the parallels between health and racism. Is it time now globally to declare racism a public health emergency in this world we live in?
Okay. So you know what? I favor it. That's something, of course, that we know. That racism has led to all of the disparities that we're discussing, whether it be economic disparities or whether it is educational disparities, definitely whether it's healthcare and healthcare disparities. But I'm not sure that I favor a different title, I think, or a different description, as opposed to racism being declared as a public health crisis. What if we had, because disproportionately across all of these countries, all of our countries, and I was happy to hear Alex bring up other countries that people don't think about, Brussels, other places where African descendants were dispersed everywhere. So let's be clear on that. Not just the US, but wherever we have been dispersed, the treatment and the outcomes have been the same. So I would favor more label or description, something like global African descendant public health crisis, because that is really what it is. So I'm not, and I think racism is obviously understood as a part of the title. So I'm not sure that I would necessarily favor it as.
It's a very good point, right? Definitely this centering the Black experience. Alex.
I just wanted to jump in on the public health crisis point because, of course, the American Public Health Association has named even more than 100 municipalities in the United States who have already, from Denver to Pittsburgh to San Antonio, identified it as such. And it really goes back to this point of the pandemic being this great revealer that was brought up, in the sense that it essentially exacerbated the existing disparities in terms of health outcomes, not only in the United States, but globally in terms of access to medication systems. And I think the big elephant in the room right now is access to vaccines when they are readily available, or any other number of measures as we begin to look at what the solutions are beyond the horizon of the pandemic. Will we be able to overcome the systemic issues that would prevent Afro-descendants from being able to access those resources?
Thanks for this, Alex. And of course, speaking of Afro-descendants, Anna, millions of Afro-descendants in your country of origin, Brazil. Is this the time to declare racism a global pandemic in Brazil?
Yeah, I think so. I'm gonna push a little bit and say yes. I think that yeah, the creation of racism is really at the core of any inequality that we face. The creation of racialized groups. That's how the West legitimize its power, its influence. And I think that a very interesting point that Alex was bringing is about the vaccines that I really would like to talk a little bit about. That there is a lot of discussions here about affordability, about access. So there are some folks that think about affordability, and that means it has to be cheap, right? I am on the group that believe that it has to be free. And when we think about this as structural issues, is it will not have any impact if one country only can have access to vaccines. When we look at the countries that are buying the vaccines that are being produced, 8 out of 10 are developed countries. So that means that we need to have a conversation about intellectual property, about the pandemic as a historical crisis that we face. And that means that it doesn't matter much if only your country get the vaccine. Everybody has to get the vaccine. And then here, there is another sensitive issue that we need to think about: international debt. So if we have countries in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa that are paying debts, how are they supposed to strengthen their health system? How are they supposed to offer universal income for the citizens? Because the focus has been to paying the debts for the rich Western countries. And thinking about Brazil, Brazil is one of the 10, right? Like when we look at the list of the 10 countries that are buying the vaccine, Brazil is one of the 10. 2 out of the 10, they are developing countries. But that's Brazil is facing a political crisis at the same time. We have an administration that completely dismissed the virus. It's doing a lot of misinformation campaigns to the population, saying that the numbers are not real, that the hospitals are lying, that they are burying people with empty coffins. That's another threat that we also face, because when at the end of the day we are talking about who are disposable, and disposable historically are us, Black people.
That very strong words there, who are disposable. Let's talk a little bit, Tosin, about Nigeria. Of course, in many ways, the African continent has not seen the huge alarming rates of COVID-19. But in terms of the pandemic, what has been the response in Nigeria, and this question of disposability of Black bodies?
That's a really good question. And, as someone who has spent the past couple of months observing that very question and considering that very question, I do have some answers, some things to share with you. So when I came back from the US, I didn't know COVID was on its way across the globe, but at the time it was March, it was early March. And I remembered coming into Nigeria, and at that time, I was already being asked to fill out health forms. My temperature was being taken at the airport. And I thought it was really excessive at the time. I thought, what's going on? Because I just came from the US where none of that was happening. And so in a way, it's interesting because I still think that there's much for us to learn about how and why we seem to have dodged that bullet. But what I do know is that we did respond. as best as we could with the population that we do and the structures that we have. In the sense that during the lockdown, literally interstates were locked down. I couldn't even go to see my parents. You couldn't go out. Even now, we still have a curfew in effect. It's been like that for months now. And so, like Anna, I have to say that the government in general has not been in denial about it. They have not tried to tell us that there was nothing there. So for that, I will give credit where credit is due. However, beyond that, in terms of the larger and broader response to COVID, in terms of the social services and the needs of the population, I think I can confidently say in that regard that we did not respond. There were some attempts that were made where, they call them palliatives. I never thought there would be a word that I would just not want to hear again. There are probably words from 2020 that I'm going to leave behind. And palliatives is definitely one of them because it became a buzzword, which was this idea of giving food to the less privileged because you feel that perhaps because there's COVID now, they may be having difficulties financially with their businesses, so they need to be fed. Well, what we found out is that in many cases, those bags of food were going to the government leaders in those communities. The community leaders were taking ownership of those palliatives and giving it to their own circles and networks. In some cases, there was an incident that happened after the massacre where they stumbled upon a warehouse full of palliatives that had not been distributed, and the government's response was, "Oh, we just got them. We were just going to start giving them out." Right. And so here again, our challenge is not necessarily around color, right? Because this is, like I said, I always call it a Black republic. Majority of us here look the same. Our skin color is the same. We're all African in origin for the most part. So that's not the issue, but do we still suffer from the legacy of that? Absolutely. Because again, to tie this back to what I said earlier at the beginning of my opening talk is, what are we looking at here? What is this season telling us? And what are these experiences? What is COVID teaching us about the realities of our individual states or places that we occupy? And like I said, COVID was revealing in the US in the terms that it showed, like was said earlier, that listen, there is disparities. There's always been disparities. And now it looks really ugly because now we are having to look at it at a time when there is no other excuse, there is no other thing to look at, there is nowhere else to gaze. This is it, and we have to confront it. So I think that happened in the US. And here, like I said, it was already predicted that there would be unrest here due to COVID. So anyone that's saying they were surprised, I would question that, just like the good doctor said earlier. It's like, we can't talk about how, wow, we're just realizing now that healthcare is there's a racist element to this, and it's a public health crisis. It's like, it's always been there. It's just that now we as a collective had no other way to look except at this. And when Anna shared her story, I was shaking my head because I remembered reading that story and I thought, this has been going on in Brazil for ages. But because of what's happening right now, it is something that people are no longer willing to accept. They want to talk about it. They want to protest about it. They just want to talk about it and figure out how they can fix this. And so that's what's happening in Nigeria as well, is that these issues have always been there. Fundamentally speaking, like I spoke about earlier, we inherited our current governance structure from our, post-colonialism. And so that we never got to really bring that down. I mean, some Francophone countries, they're just now starting to address those issues as to what does the structure that we've been left with, which is inherently also a racist culture. It's a racist structure, right? Inherently, we know that. And so you leave that on the continent, that, that means that it's okay over there because it's in Africa. It can't be racist over there, but it can be because we've essentially inherited structures that do not serve us. They do not serve the people. They marginalize those that do not have, and they elevate, as always in society, those that are part of the ruling class. And so COVID has revealed to us that there is a huge, huge gap between, and it's always been there, but it's revealed it now and people are not happy. And so what happens next is the question, is this something that we're going to address through governance, engaging with governance, policies, structures, we got to figure that out. Is that the solution to this? Or is it something else where we begin to tear down these structures and say, we need a revolution, which is essentially what this is. Beyond the rebellion is the revolution, right? The rebellion is the Black Lives Matter, it's the Arab Spring, it's the NSARS. That's your alarm clock that goes off and says we've had enough. But what happens after that is the question that we have to ask. And that's why I believe a key part of the focus here is about the policies and what we need to do to move forward, because a lot of times we find ourselves in this circular arguments and discourse because we continue to have the same discussions, we continue to observe the same truths, but we have not yet figured out how to address or start to tackle them. And I think that's the next phase that we need to start moving in, at least in Nigeria. And I definitely am hopeful that even in the United States and elsewhere in the world where Black people continue to be marginalized or people of color continue to be marginalized, that we start to find our voices and the way out to say, how do we reclaim some sense of agency in this space? And I think, quite frankly, you know, the US did a fantastic job of saying, even though our lives are essentially in crisis right now, we are, you know, being threatened existentially. I mean, that's just how I look at it. But they still came out in droves at the polls. And that's what they've been doing for a long time. And that's what I voted from here. And we'll continue to do that to make sure that we continue to protect ourselves as much as possible within the system that's not built to serve us. Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about that idea of moving into the next phase and what policies could look like, policies that would address systemic racism in your respective countries, but also globally. Perhaps for this one, I'll start with Anna.
Sure. I think one of the main points for us in the global South and Black people everywhere, it doesn't matter which part of the globe we live, is one of the things that really bothers me is that we still are waiting for the global North to give us the protocols, the health protocols of how to deal with COVID. We are still looking at countries like Switzerland to see what we can copy from them, rather than start to develop global South protocols and approaches to COVID. And here I want to give an example of a favela in Sao Paulo, the biggest favela in the city, with more than 20,000 people living there, that is Paraisópolis. They developed their own community health model for COVID. And here I want to explain a little bit more about it, because I do think that this can be replicated in other contexts. So the idea is each 50 residents of the favela, you have one community president. This person is responsible to check every day these 50 people. So they report to the resident association about symptoms, cases, who needs food, who doesn't have access to water. So they create this database. The community rent 3 ambulances. So not the government, the community is paying every day for 3 ambulances and 10 doctors that only serve that favela. So they are completely available for the 20,000 inhabitants. This costs $1,000 a day, and the community is paying itself. So this is one of the models that I really would like us to think about how we can replicate. And another thing that they have, they create quarantine houses, because normally in the favelas, we have a lot of people living in the same household. It's not possible to quarantine. So they create different houses where people that got COVID can quarantine. And this is the whole community without any support of the government. So imagine when we think about public policies that can be thinking that is centering on the way that we live, because we were not gonna change the way that we live for the past 200, 300 years. We need to develop our own approaches rather than look at the global North approach. And I just want to say one more thing, that is something that is really making sure that people have access to food, for example. In Brazil and in other countries, what we are doing is community mutuals emergency funds. So the community is also donating so we can support people that need. Of course, that the scale, it's never comparable to a public policy. But here we also have another conversation about the rising of fundamentalism and conservadorism in the world, and how the voting, as Tosun was saying, it's important. So in this election, Brazil have a local elections 2 weeks ago. So it was the first time in history that we vote in large numbers for transgender people, indigenous people, Black women. And this will make a difference. This will make a difference next year because, again, we are talking about life and death situation. We are talking about to have an ambulance available for people. This make a difference about who's going to live and who's going to die. And we also need to remember that COVID has a 3% chances of fatal cases. This is not a lot. So what is killing people is the other inequalities structures that was already there. And that's also something that I also want to talk about, how sometimes the same doctor, the same clinic would offer a different treatment to a white person or a Black person. And this was with COVID or before COVID. So there are very deep conversations here that I think we can really talk about, but I really want to push for Global South protocols.
Talking about Global South protocol, Casey, I'll take a dab at this question of what kind of policies can we have in place to combat systemic racism?
Thank you. So first, I want to add this to the conversation that actually our team, the team that we put in place, is led by an African-American doctor who has the bioethics center at Tuskegee University. And he was one of the first to talk about the impact of COVID-19. He was interviewed and he continues to be interviewed pretty widely about the impact on African descendants in the US. But in order to, so what he leads the effort, but we added to him a doctor in the UK who is phenomenal. And we have a team that includes an educator and economist and some others. So and as I mentioned earlier, also the Dr. Vicente, president of the only Black university in Brazil, is also a very big part of the work that we do. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is what we have found the kind of the common issues across these countries in terms of what might be some different sorts of ways in which we should approach the work. And this is in keeping with what everybody is already saying, of course. But first and foremost, the first thing we have agreed to is, why do we ask politicians what do we need to do about health disparities and outcomes? We need to be talking to healthcare deliverers, doctors. That's the very first thing. I find it just absolutely amazing that we always are quoting what politicians are saying. They are not on the front line of healthcare. So that's the first thing. We must, and so some of the things that doctors have said, speak to some of the issues. I think that Anna mentioned is that we need to galvanize the community itself, because to bring in outsiders to communities and tell them what they need to do to enhance their health has never worked historically, and it currently does not work. So we need to galvanize, what some doctors are saying is that we need to galvanize the voices within the communities. The other big issue that that has been listed as why disproportionately African descendants are dying from the pandemic. It has to do with chronic health issues. Well, why doesn't anybody ever ask, what do we need to do with those issues? How did they come to be, and how can those be targeted and addressed in an ongoing way, not just certainly highlighted now, but those should have been addressed going forward anyway. And then obviously the work of Tuskegee is really important because issues of trust and trustworthiness are really impacting even the vaccines, whether people want to take them, whether they trust the doctors who when they are made available, whether they will want to. But you know what, Dr. Warren, our leader, says perfectly. But to get trust, you have to have trustworthiness. People have to be worthy of the trust of the people that they are saying don't trust us. So those are some issues, I think, in some ways in which we're going to have to address issues in different ways. I want to talk a little bit. My last point is about the policy making and the voting and what that means. We have been voting 400 years, maybe not at the same level, but we're still facing the same issues. We have to ask, we have to then begin to think about, well, what are different questions we have to ask? How do we address those? How do we make demands about whether it's been Republican Party or remember, there have been many Democratic presidents elected, but we're still 400 years out facing some of the same issues. So those, I know I'm pretty emotional about this, but the time is now. We can't continue to wait. Our collective voices, we're facing the same issues, and we need to start looking at how to address those issues collectively. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I guess, Alex, if you can tell us a little bit about these policies that perhaps could be put in place to bring the end to systemic racism.
I want to thank Dr. Freeman for teaming me up again with what are very specific examples. So over the last decade, there have already been agreements, I think, and it's great that we're talking about Brazil and South America. There are existing on the books compacts that are addressing racism and systemic racism, between agreements between the United States and Brazil, for example. And what some policies that have existed, of course, there has not been a sufficient enough investment in this. It's only been a little drop in the bucket in terms of the scale and scope of the historical challenge, but it's a start. And what has been done is, in a number of lanes, there have been developments of public-private partnerships, exchanges with historically Black colleges and universities to look at access to education and the investment of education. But also there have been a number of exchanges between law enforcement and other practitioners in terms of addressing disparities within the justice system. So if you take the model that is essentially been incubated on a very small scale through some of these compacts that exist, there needs to be really a substantial, I would say even Marshall Plan scale investment in those types of agreements between the United States and other countries. So the exchange of technical expertise, addressing the issues associated with intellectual property that was brought up earlier to ensure broad and I would also join the camp of free access when possible to vaccines and other resources, because we need to recognize this is such a unique inflection point that we need to be, as a global community, all in on delivering a response that serves us all. So fortunately, politics really matter. And I think Anna really brought up this point. We need people to be engaged politically, not only at the federal level, but at the local level and the municipalities, because we have seen with this pandemic how it has been so politicized at the federal level that local communities and municipalities have had to take it upon themselves to really do what's safe for themselves and mobilize those resources. So we need people to be politically active. Fortunately, there have been some exchanges, especially in this digital environment. In September, on September 22nd, there was a joint session of the European Parliament, for example, with the United States Congress, where members of Congress and senators started talking about specifically how to address systemic racism. And so we need to seize this political moment to drive through the secure commitments on policies that can make that change.
Speaking of seizing this moment, Tosin, what would policies that would bring an end to systemic racism look like in Nigeria, where you've clearly talked about how systemic racism lives in the systems that are already in place?
Yeah. So, I'm going to take a page from my colleague Anna's book right now and probably say something that might be a little bit unpopular or maybe a little bit harsh sounding. I think that's the wrong question for us to ask ourselves, because like I said earlier, when you understand the nature of systematic and systemic structures, to think that we can actually physically change that, especially in the case of, let's say, the US, I would say that that might not be quite the approach that we take. Like Dr. Freeman said, this is not the first time that Black people have shown up to the polls. We've had a Black president. We've had the Voting Rights Act. We've had many wins as people of color in the US, and yet here we are. And what that tells us, I think, if we're being really truthful with ourselves, if we really want to take a look in the mirror and admit what we're looking at, it is that the DNA of the US in itself is that of racism. And DNA, by definition, as we know what DNA is, cannot be restructured, it cannot be modified. I mean, unless you're doing CRISPR and all those kind of other tech things, it just is what it is. That is the fabric, as they say, of America. Now, am I saying that there's nothing for us to do? Of course not. There have been, like I said, there have been wins for people of color across the world, including the global South. But where have those wins come from? I'll go back to what Dr. Friedman said. It hasn't come from the fact that we've looked to government. Because if you look to government, the chances of you being disappointed in it because the system was built to really not engage with you and to not really help you or support you. And so whenever we keep leaning on this idea, especially in the US, of government intervention, I think we're looking in the wrong place. I think that there are things that we can do there. Like I say, voting is not, it's not something light. It's something that helps preserve lives. It helps to preserve our sanity in countries where we may not have the same rights. So we show up because we know that's important. And I think that's worthy exercise, and it's something that needs to be done. But in terms of a long-term solution to systemic and systematic racism, there isn't one. We're gonna have to figure out how to work in these systems. And that's what we've been trying to figure out. And it's not necessarily the best. I'll answer some of the questions that were brought up. Why did COVID affect the Black community? I'm a city planner. And I can tell you that, I worked in community development and mobilization and organization for over a decade. We have food deserts in low-income areas. They don't even have grocery stores there because there's no economic drivers there. There's nothing that would bring a Whole Foods that they can't even afford. There's nothing that would even bring a regular grocery store. So a lot of people in those poor neighborhoods, they eat food from the corner store, from the bodega, not fresh, not organic. They eat fast food. That's what we're dealing with. And so until we start to take it hard, and I think that's what this season has been, this year of COVID has been, a return to ourselves, to question ourselves, to interrogate ourselves as to what we are contributing and what we're doing in terms of addressing some of these issues. Because until we can begin to act as a collective, until we can begin to see some mindset shifts, we'll keep having these conversations. And unfortunately, those mindset shifts also, it's a circular problem, because in a way, you realize those mindsets are there because of the systematic and systemic nature of racism. If you look at the criminal justice system in the US, I mean, how can so many Black men be in jail? How can so many Black men be part of the, this prison industrial complex? That was a deliberate thing that was done to people of color in America. That was done even after the amendment was passed that said that they had freedoms. That they said, oh, no, you don't. We're going to put it in there so that anytime you guys try to vote, you're going to have a criminal record. And we'll arrest you for things like making noise or loitering. That's systemic. So that's what we're going to continue to see, is that, like I said, even if there's no one manning the ship is going to run on its own. So how do we then, as a collective, come up with solutions? So then going back to the global South in the question of Nigeria, I'm going to go back to what Anna said, which was about how at the end of the day, we have to start looking for African solutions to African problems. I've been saying that for a long time. I say it in the space that I work in, which is technology, is that we don't get to copy and paste solutions in the West to the things, or in the global North to what's going on here in the global South, because it just doesn't work. We have a whole different set of challenges. The terrain is different. The history is different. The traumas are different. And so we have to think about how, like was said several times, how do we collaboratively come together as a people to say enough is enough, and how can we begin to fix things within ourselves first and foremost, within our communities second, and then on a larger scale, we can then scale that to then start to look at local government politics and then national politics. Of course, we can play all of these cards simultaneously, but what I'm saying is that it would be very remiss to keep looking at government to save us from this plague, and what is essentially a virus in itself. I mean, that's the irony of this, is that racism in itself is a virus that we haven't found a vaccine for. And I don't think we're going to find one anytime soon. So then what do we do to inoculate ourselves and to protect ourselves and to drive our own agendas forward that help us to see economic benefits? And so that's where I come in to say Nigerians and Africans as a whole, we're going to have to start to have some mindset shifts, because at the end of the day, I cannot tell you that the government we have is not a reflection of the people. It is, and Trump also was a reflection of the people as well, right? That's another parallel, is that the people get the government that they deserve to an extent, right? And so when you start to see that kind of illness emerging in any state where the government, is not looking for the people, you have to ask the people, how did this happen? So we have to question ourselves, and we have to start to retrace our steps and think about the things we can do on a small scale level. Because again, as a community organizer and mobilizer for so many years, and having worked in economic development as well, I know that this is not an overnight thing. There are too many things that we have to dismantle. And so, for example, when we talk about health disparities, we got to talk about nutrition. We got to talk about access to healthy food. We got to talk about how people buy that healthy food, because where do they get the money from? It's a rabbit hole, right? But there's things we can do. And that's what things that people on this panel are doing in their own specialized area. They are trying to address those issues. They're trying to bring together partnerships, collaborations, policies, and that's what we need to do more of. In countries like Nigeria, we need to start doing more of that. I think the US has a better grasp on that than we do in terms of collaboration and partnerships and sort of like one common direction. And so I think if we can start to build on that here, then we may have a hope of one day hopefully getting to the top of this government, this infrastructure we have, the structure that is not serving us anymore, and we can start to figure out how to dismantle that in a way that does serve us. But to do that, we have to educate ourselves first. And so that is my final thought on, as far as Nigeria goes and other countries that have been colonized, is that in Nigeria, for example, governance and history was taken out of our books. The curriculum, the national curriculum, for years, we don't have it. I think it just maybe started getting reinstituted this year. So how do you have a populace that can vote when they don't even understand what voting looks like, what good governance looks like? They don't even understand how bills are passed or laws are made. So until we can start to think about those kinds of, sort of foundational level issues, I don't think we can start to talk about the eradication of the structures themselves.
Dr. Feeman, I'll pass this question to you. You did mention that within your own organization, you have people from different parts of the world working. You've mentioned the UK. What could countries do to come together in this critical moment as they're facing COVID-19 and as their own citizenry are questioning their policies around race?
Yes, thank you. First and foremost, let me say, we must disrupt the whole notion that we cannot work together. That's I was just thinking to myself, divide and conquer has worked to perfection. Why do we always begin with, okay, our cultures are different. We can't, we can't do this, or this country can't do that, or we can't then work together. If you, what I find is when you bring people to, I mean, the our the people work overtime. I mean, individuals who you would not imagine. This was a good example. On the last week, Dr. Vicente asked us to put together a panel in celebration of Brazil Black Heritage Month. We pulled, to put together for that panel, we had the Right Honorable David Lammy out of the UK, our board chair, who was a former premier of Bermuda, the doctor from the UK, Dr. Edaboy, and Dr. Warren, another colleague from Brazil who lives in the US now. And they were delighted to come together. So this whole notion that if we don't ask, we never know whether or not people are going to want to come together to work together or not. The other thing is that people are open to hearing different ideas. I never find that people are not, are not comfortable listening to different ideas or from different countries. Where we all begin is the fact that this is a time of urgency. I mean, if you stop to think about, I think I guess one writer, for example, referred to it as we have to focus now on the overexposed and most ignored. Even those of, if you start to think about it, those of us on this panel will do very well. I mean, we're gonna keep moving forward, but the vast majority of African descendants are in poverty. That's across every single country, the US, everywhere else. And so we have to stop and think about how do we address our collectively these issues when they're the same. They have been same since we were dispersed across different countries. So the notion we have to disrupt the notion of we can't work together, move away from making divide and conquer to be as successful. It was a formula in place that has worked to perfection. And we as a people have to figure out now how to disrupt that and move ahead with all of the issues that are facing the majority of our people. Because what, we're only as strong as the weak among us. And so we do have to pay more attention to, as I indicated, the overexposed and the most ignored.
Dr. Freeman, I just want to follow up with a comment right there because I want to take this opportunity to say that in talking about some of my policy ideas, I actually yesterday moderated I think I shared with my colleagues here, moderated a panel for the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG. But the particular topic that I was moderating was around how we can build bridges with the diaspora. And I think that that's what you're talking about, because we had a very in-depth conversations around how that sense of urgency seems. So if I were to connect the dots here to say, this time really was a time of revelation, but it was also a time of connection to say, hey, wait a minute, it looks like we're kind of going through the same thing. How do we help each other? Right? So it's like that light bulb went off all of a sudden. This was the first time when that massacre happened here. I received so many calls from the US. Are you okay? Do you need anything? How can we help? How do we donate? How do you need to partner with us to help drive any kind of amplification of what's going on? People were very engaged, more than I expected that they would be. But there were still some breakdowns, because I remember that when BLM happened, right, and I was trying to make a lot of noise about it, folks here in Nigeria didn't quite get it, because there was that breakdown, right? That bridge wasn't there to say, I know what my people in America are going to, I know what BLM is, because we don't necessarily identify with all the struggles. And so I think it's an organic sort of like revolution that's happening, I hope, and maybe I'm a bit optimistic, but it's sort of like there's a consciousness that's spreading this year. And I think, if someone asked me that, what was the outcome of the End SARS protest? I'll tell you that, well, if nothing else, it definitely raised the political consciousness of the youth and of the general population as to what's really going on. And so I think if we can continue to raise that consciousness, hold on to that energy, and then try to think of ways that we can collaborate with those in the global north or elsewhere around the world where we are facing the same type of struggles, how do we bring our resources together? How do we bring our minds together? How do we as a collective? And I think that's what Dr. Freeman is saying, because they did do a number on us. Within the Black, body, there is divisiveness. There are those that are in the Caribbean, the culture is different. Those in America, culture is different. Africans, so they have divided us in such a way that we can't even see where we meet up and where we converge. And it's right there. The struggle of the Black man continues, and it will continue until we start to come together as one to say, enough is enough. We need to come together like other groups and say, how do we protect our interests? How do we protect our lives? How do we protect our children, our generations that are coming after us? And until we start to get that sort of collaborative feel and disruption of that, like you said, that sense of we can't work together, we're not going to get very far. And that even goes for Nigerians as well, is we have to adopt that collaborative approach. We have to start adopting that service-oriented approach to start coming together so that we can support one another through these struggles.
I think this is a really good way to end. We've had the immense opportunity to exchange with each other and had also some Q&A. So thank you for those who did send their questions that our panelists were able to share. Thank you so very much to the Policy Center for the New South. Thank you to everybody here, the panelists, for telling us about this important topic that is not going away, as we've heard, and that people will have to find solutions to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amara.